Today's brief has been created with open source information readily available on the internet as well as books. However, take it with a pinch of salt because some aspects have been kept secret due to said country's Official Secrets Act, and sometimes Wikipedia is probably the best place to find the information. So sit back, relax, and let's get into today's briefing. HMS Unicorn was a one-off light maintenance aircraft carrier built for the British Royal Navy. The idea for her conception came about due to the Abyssinia crisis of 1934 and 1935. From this crisis, the Admiralty realised that they need some sort of depot ship to support aircraft carriers in active service, similar in the ways that destroyer and submarine tenders work. Admiral Reginald Henderson would be instrumental in the approval as he was the controller of the Navy. He wanted the ship to be a multi-role vessel, one of repair and maintenance, and the second to be able to operate as an aircraft carrier, like normal aircraft carriers. Unicorn would be ordered on April 14, 1939 from the Harland & Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Northern Ireland. An ironic day in the dockyard's history, however, being the day that their most famous ship hit an iceberg some 27 years earlier. Her keel would be laid on June 26, 1939, with launching on November 20, 1941 and being completed and commissioned in early 1943. Her construction would be halted occasionally due to the war, as more critical units would be prioritised. However, she was completed as a light aircraft carrier, without her maintenance suite installed. Unicorn would be 16,500 tons as standard and 20,300 tons at full load. She would be 195.1 metres long with a 27.5 metre beam and a 7 metre draft. She'd be powered by 4 water tube boilers and 2 Parson geared steam turbines, powering 2 shafts at 40,000 shaft horsepower for 24 knots. Relatively slow for an aircraft carrier of the early 1940s. Her range would be 7,000 nautical miles at 13.5 knots, and should have complement of 1,700 officers and ratings. The ship would sport a full-length flight deck, as well as arrestor gear, and sporting a steam catapult. Looking internally, the ship was fitted with a double hangar deck, both 5 metres tall. However, the lower one would be longer than the upper one. The aircraft could be fed between the flight deck and the hangar decks by 2 lifts, one forward and one kind of amidships. The ship would be fitted with its own self-defense weapons, and these consist of, in the long-range department, 4 of the excellent dual quick-firing 4-inch guns. Now, these weapons were able to shoot down a target out to 9.9 nautical miles with a rate of fire about 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Close range AA would be 4 quad 2-pounder pom-poms. Effective range was able to be about half a nautical mile away from the ship. And then finally, she'd be fitted with 2 dual and 8 single 20mm Orlkin cannons, with an effective range of about 0.4 nautical miles. The ship would be commissioned with radar, and these would be as follows. 1. Type 281 Bravo early warning radar, as well as 2 Type 285 gunnery radars. In addition to this, the pom-poms would also be fitted with their own directors. Unicorn would be armoured, like pretty much every single other British aircraft carrier. But this would be, however, very minimal. The flight deck would be 2 inches thick, the magazine was 2 to 3 inches thick, and the bulkheads were about 1.5 inches thick. The aircraft complement would be 33 aircraft of all shapes and sizes that were in service at the time she was commissioned. She would pretty much operate anything from the Fleet Air Arms arsenal. Her service career would take her all over the Northern Hemisphere. She would conduct workup in April of 1943 with 818 and 824 squadrons, landing a total of about 15 Swordfish torpedo bombers and 9 Seafires. With workup completed, she transited south at the end of the month to escort MKF-15 to Gibraltar. She would carry some RAF Bristol Beaufighters down there, so they could be operated at Gibraltar. She would then remain in Gib until June, when she escorted the returning convoy back to the Clyde. Next up was a foray with the carrier Illustrious. She and co would sail towards the Norwegian waters as part of Operation Governor. This was a simulated landing designed to draw the German eyes away from Sicily, where the Allies were actually going to invade in reality. After the successful invasion of Sicily, she would be assigned to Force 5, the flotilla of the aircraft carriers under the command of Admiral Philip Vane. The objective of the flotilla was to provide air cover to the Allied invasion of Salerno. She would ditch the Swordfish bombers, except for a handful for self-defence, for sea fires of 809 and 897 Naval Air Squadrons. Overall, she had 33 aircraft embarked, which this was her maximum complement. She sailed from Gibraltar in August, before transitioning towards the central Mediterranean for intensive training prior to the start of the landings on September 9th. Her sea fires carried out 75 sorties on the first day and 60 on the second, 44 on the third and 14 on the fourth. The numbers of dwindling sorties was due to the fact that the Seafire was not performing well in low-speed landings on carriers' decks. It got that bad that Illustrious and Formidable, who were further out to sea, providing air cover in case the Regia Marina came to play, had to send their own aircraft to bolster Unicorns. Although a spot of good news was a temporary airfield had been set up on the 12th, and 6 Seafires had been based out of the airfield. By the 20th, she was back in the United Kingdom, unloading a full complement of damaged Seafires by her self-propelled lighter, as well as by shoreside crane. Whilst alongside in Glasgow, she would be refitted to how she was meant to leave the builder's yard, as an aircraft repair ship. The refit lasted until December, where she would sail to join up with the carrier Illustrious, the battlecruiser Renown, the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, along with their smaller escorts, bound for the Far East with 4 Swordfish embarked. By the end of January, she was alongside in India disembarking her aircraft, and then started to proceed to Ceylon by early February. Between February and May, she operated in the Indian Ocean, being used as a deck landing training ship. The idea being that if the aircraft crashes, well, at least it's on a ship that is designed to repair aircraft. So, probably a good idea. She then took a brief refit in August until she could sail back into the Indian Ocean. After operating in the area, she was ordered to conduct anti-submarine warfare operations off South Africa. There she would be modified to accommodate American engines. This would let her service them as they had different electrical fittings and different screw fittings, because, well, why not? Around the same time, she would be transferred to the British Pacific Fleet, but it would take till New Year's Day that she would actually start to proceed east, arriving in Colombo in early January 1945. She would proceed by conducting deck landing practices for the Wafus before entering the combat area. She proceeded alongside Sydney and unloaded, in total, 82 aircraft and 120 engines, moving all the available stocks ashore. After a few runs of moving supplies, she would end up training for Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. The Pacific Fleet's role was to attack Japanese airfields on Sakishima Island and Formosa during the early stages of the invasion. Unicorn would operate as a place for aircraft to prepare for issue to other aircraft carriers. In essence, an issuing station for aircraft. She wouldn't be tasked to repair aircraft, but over the duration of March to May, she would service, repair and modify 105 aircraft, showing her utility as a maintenance ship. By the end of May, she would be sailing for Brisbane, arriving in the early part of July for a draft to be cleaned to improve her speed, as well as to add more replacement aircraft. She would sail for Manus, arriving on the 22nd of July, for operations in the final attack of the Japanese home islands. She would remain here until August 15th, when the Japanese surrendered. Her role was now changed to that of an aircraft ferry vessel, transporting aircraft and men back to Australia until November 6th. She would depart Sydney for Plymouth in December, arriving in January 1946, where she would be decommissioned and placed into the reserve fleet. She would remain in this state for 3 years, until she was reactivated for service in the Far East. She was sent out to support the new Colossus-class aircraft carrier, HMS Triumph. She would sail on September 22nd, 1949, from Devonport with Seafires and Fireflies embarked. After a few months, she was in the Pacific Ocean, calling into ports around the region, as well as putting into HMS Tamar, the base at Hong Kong. She would be alongside in Singapore in 1950, disembarking her aircraft and maintenance staff in preparation for sailing home to be put back into reserve. However, she would receive a signal stating that the Korean War had just kicked off. Her role in this war would be one of a replenishment carrier, being the one-stop shop for all spare aircraft for Royal Navy and Commonwealth carriers operating in Korean waters. A tall order for a single ship. She would sail for war on July 11th, arriving at Sasebo, the forward operating base, 9 days later. Here she would move over 7 Seafires and 5 Fireflies to the Triumph prior to her sailing. Whilst the fleet sorted, Unicorn remained at anchor, where in August she would embark the 1st Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, where she sailed from Sasebo to Hong Kong and then transported the 27th Brigade from Hong Kong to Busan. By September, she did a supply run to Singapore before putting in for maintenance period and a small refit lasting about 2 months. She would come back into the fray in December, carrying 400 troops and her usual complement of Seafires and Fireflies. She'd be used for deck landing practices en route to Sasebo. She stayed around the area for a few months until March, when she transported her first lot of jet-powered aircraft. These would be Gloucester Meteors of No. 77 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. She would be one of the few British carriers to embark jet aircraft, even though she didn't operate them at this point. But she would stay in Sasebo for at least 3 months, being used as an accommodation ship, until she resumed her usual schedule of ferrying aircraft to and from the ships in the fleet. In October, she would cause her first damage to a nation in her career. She was transiting the Shumaneski Strait. The weather was bleak, there was heavy snowfall, and there would be some power lines crossing the strait, but due to the weight of the snow, the lines sagged and they ended up snagging and snapping the power lines on the mast, causing some areas of Japan to lose power. After running away from the damage, she's met up with the carrier Warrior, where they would exchange crews in Singapore for training purposes, but she would then end up in refit again. There was a study conducted to see if she could be modernised to make her capable of operating modern, heavier jet aircraft. In this, she would have to be upgraded with new steamed catapults, as well as reinforcing her flight deck and replacing her lifts for larger ones, as well as discarding the 2 hangars for a single one. While this study was taking place, she would head back out to sea in late January of 1952 for ferrying duties. After a few months of this, she would be operating with the carrier HMS Ocean, acting as a spare flight deck for damaged aircraft. She would make a run for Singapore for replenishment of her spare aircraft and go back into the fray alongside Ocean, and even borrowing 4 of the Sea Furies for a combat air patrol, whilst the latter was conducting strike operations against the North Koreans. At some point in this engagement, she would actually, apparently, conduct possibly the first ever coastal bombardment by an aircraft carrier, where supposedly she shot up a North Korean coastal positions. However, I think that might just be a made-up dit. By October, she was back in dock for maintenance, repair to subsystems, as well as de-rusting and a lick of paint, before embarking the First Sea Lord, Admiral Roderick McGrigor, as well as the Commander-in-Chief, Far East Station, for a tour of the Commonwealth forces in Japan, which was probably an impressive feat and an impressive sight. As the end of the year approached, she was sent for a refit in Singapore for 6 months, designed to keep her in operation for longer, doing work to the engines, piping, as well as things that keep a ship operational. Whilst this was happening, the ship's company would go on leave. July of the next year would roll around and she would sail back to Japan for combat operations. But en route, she would respond to a distress signal from a merchant ship being attacked by pirates in the South China Sea, possibly the distant cousins of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Upon arrival, Unicorn started to circle the merchant ship with all guns brung to bear, aiming at the ship. After the pirates probably said, no, jumped in their boats and drove off as fast as possible, she would continue to sail to Japan. The day after the pirate incident, the Korean armistice was signed, bringing the conflict to a ceasement. She would meet up with her old friend Ocean, and they would conduct 2 patrols to monitor if the North Koreans were complying with said armistice. She would conclude her patrols and sail from the Far East on October 15th, arriving a month and 2 days later at Devonport Naval Base in Plymouth. Upon entry, she would be put into reserve. The scheme for refit that was proposed a year earlier was cancelled when she got back, because the idea for refitting proper carriers with angled fly decks was given more of a priority. She remained in reserve in Guz until she was placed on the disposal list in 1958, being sold for scrap in June 1959 and arriving near Glasgow to begin the process of demolition, with her ceasing to exist in October of 1960. Thank you very much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Before you go, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with my latest videos, as well as commenting, and if you want to, subscribe to the Patreon page to support the channel. All I need to say is, here's a sneak peek at next week's video.